The first time the sun rose over Tijuana after the corpses were found, the smell lingered in the alleys: blood, gasoline, fear. Neighbors whispered about bodies dragged into doorways, set ablaze, some left to rot for days. No one would claim them. It wasn't always this way. Tijuana was once a city of border dreams, families who crossed the line for jobs, vendors who sold fruit on cracked sidewalks, children chasing volleyballs down sunlit boulevards. But behind that veneer, something dark had taken root. Something that needed territory, respect, and it was willing to kill anyone who stood in its way. In 2007, the Mexican government declared what it called Operation Baja California, a sweeping operation meant to restore order in this border state. Soldiers, Marines, federal police, thousands deployed. Choppers overhead. Intelligence units tracking drug tunnels beneath the ground. Raids against warehouses hidden behind suburban homes. Sweeps in the hills above Ensenada. But even as forces moved in, the bodies kept piling up. See, this was not just a war of cartels versus state. It was a war between cartels, each competing to control the smuggling routes into California, each desperate to dominate the plazas, the extortion, the people. The infamous Arellano Félix family, built on ruthlessness and loyalty, once seemed unbeatable. Their grip over Tijuana traffic was ironclad. But over time, cracks appeared. Brothers were killed. Leaders arrested. Corruption seeped even into the police forces. And then there was 2009. Over 5,800 drug-related killings swept across Mexico that year. Not all in Baja California, but when the death toll in the rest of the country is rising, the pressure, the violence, the desperation spill over. In Baja, the shootings became daily, almost mundane: drive-bys, night raids, kidnappings. Some families simply vanished. Some wandered, clutching photos of sons and daughters, asking in clinics and morgues. For some, fleeing seemed the only option. Don't walk after dark, mothers told children. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, morgues with the dead. Journalists stopped publishing names, fearing reprisals. Police stations became targets. Trust in the uniform was gone. Journalists, once fearless, began to go silent. Publishing cartel names, even whispering about corruption, could mean a death sentence. Some fled the state. Some stayed and vanished. And yet, despite despair, the war advanced. Because at the core of it all was the plaza, the border crossings into the U.S., the highways running north, the corridors where billions in drugs, cash, weapons moved every month. Whoever controlled those corridors controlled power. Whoever held the fear held control. So when the government announced it had captured an Arellano Félix leader, or raided a torture house, the city held its breath. Would this be the end? The turning point? Or just another chapter in a war that had no mercy and no end? Tonight, we begin the story of the war for Baja California. Who rose, who fell? The betrayals, the terror. The thousands of lives lost, not as numbers, but as lost futures. In the next section, we'll travel back to the roots, how decades of cartel rule, border smuggling, political complicity, and fractured leadership laid the trap that turned a vibrant region into a killing ground. Keep watching. Because what comes next will explain everything.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
To understand how Baja California descended into chaos, we must first understand the geography. Baja is not just any strip of land on the map, it is a peninsula stretching down into the Pacific, connected to the mainland only by the border it shares with the United States. And at its northern tip lies Tijuana, a city sitting directly across from San Diego. Every road, every checkpoint, every border crossing here has value measured not just in pesos or dollars, but in billions of dollars worth of narcotics, cash, and weapons flowing north and south. Whoever holds Baja holds the gateway. Whoever holds Tijuana holds the keys to the kingdom. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, one family seized this opportunity, the Arellano Félix brothers. Known collectively as the organization Arellano Félix, or simply the Tijuana Cartel, they were not farmers turned criminals. They were educated, cunning, and brutal. Each brother had a role. Some handled finance, others security, others the bloodshed. Together, they became the architects of one of the most feared cartels in Mexico's history. Their power came not just from drugs but from violence. The Arellanos controlled Tijuana with fear so absolute that few dared to resist. Torture, kidnappings, public executions, they ruled by example. If a business refused to pay extortion, its owner might be found in a ditch the next day. If a police officer spoke out, his family would vanish. Even the city's nightclubs and casinos were infiltrated. The line between legitimate business and cartel empire blurred until there was none. But the Arellanos had a weapon more dangerous than guns: corruption. Politicians dined with them. Police chiefs cashed their envelopes. Officers took orders from cartel lieutenants. Judges were bought. Whole institutions bent to their will. To live in Tijuana during those years was to live under the shadow of the Arellano Félix Organization, whether you acknowledged it or not. Yet even in their dominance, the Arellanos had enemies. South and east, the Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was building something bigger. Chapo was ambitious, relentless, and he saw Tijuana not as someone else's property, but as the most valuable smuggling corridor in the hemisphere. And he was willing to go to war for it. The first clashes came quietly: ambushes on the highways, assassinations of lieutenants, bodies left in trunks. But soon, the violence spilled into daylight. Shootouts erupted in crowded streets, shopping centers, even outside schools. Ordinary citizens ducked for cover as cartel bullets flew. For the first time, the Arellano Félix Organization was being challenged. The war for Baja had begun. The Arellanos responded the only way they knew: escalation. More men, more weapons, more blood. They unleashed their enforcers, men trained not in subtlety, but in terror. Torture houses appeared across the city, where captives screamed through the night. The message was clear: this was still their plaza. But Sinaloa's reach kept growing, and Chapo was patient. He knew cracks would form. As the millennium turned, the balance shifted. Some Arellano Félix brothers were killed in gunfights. Others were captured. Leadership fractured. And with every arrest or death, loyalty wavered. Rivals began to circle. Soldiers within their own ranks began to consider betrayals. The iron grip that once held Tijuana was loosening. And yet, the violence did not slow, it escalated. As Sinaloa pressed harder, the Arellanos grew more desperate. Baja California was no longer just a border state. It was a battlefield where every block, every road, every crossing could tip the scales of a billion-dollar empire. Civilians paid the price. And in the shadows, waiting for their chance, a new generation of killers began to rise. By the mid-2000s, those men would seize their moment, ruthless, unpredictable, and hungry for power. What followed would drown Baja California in blood. By the early 2000s, the walls around the Arellano Félix empire began to crumble. One by one, their leaders were arrested or killed. Benjamin Arellano Félix was captured in 2002. Ramon Arellano Félix, perhaps the most feared of the brothers, was gunned down the same year. Eduardo, Francisco Javier, and other siblings followed, some in handcuffs, others in coffins. For the first time in a decade, the cartel's iron grip faltered. And into the cracks, chaos seeped in. When a criminal empire loses its head, the body doesn't stop moving, it thrashes. And that thrashing creates new monsters. With the Arellano Félix brothers gone, two figures rose to claim what remained of Tijuana's cartel throne. On one side, Fernando Sanchez Arellano, known as El Ingeniero, the engineer. Calm, calculating, heir to the family legacy. On the other, Teodoro Garcia Cimental, known simply as El Teo. Brutal, unpredictable, a man who thrived in blood. What began as rivalry quickly became a war within the war. Teo industrialized them. Dozens a week. Victims chained in safe houses, ransoms demanded at gunpoint. When families couldn't pay, their loved ones were slaughtered. Bodies dissolved in acid. Heads dumped in public plazas. Tijuana lived in terror. Anyone could vanish. Anyone could be next. El Ingeniero fought back with precision. He had inherited the Arellano Félix structure, the corrupt police officers, the alliances with businesses, the remnants of the old networks. He tried to contain El Teo's savagery, to rebuild order through fear the way his uncles had. But the result was not order. It was carnage. Because in the streets, their feud meant one thing, an explosion of bloodshed unlike anything Baja California had ever seen. Ordinary life collapsed. Families stopped going out at night. Children were kept from school. Restaurants emptied. Businesses received calls, pay a tax to the cartel, or burn. Owners who refused found grenades lobbed through their windows. Taxi drivers were shot for failing to deliver messages. Street vendors disappeared after refusing extortion. Tijuana, once bustling with border trade and nightlife, became a ghost city after sundown. The journalists, who once chronicled the rise of the Arellanos, fell silent. Newspapers stopped printing cartel names. Reporters were kidnapped, tortured, executed. Radio hosts vanished. What wasn't silenced by bullets was silenced by fear. For the citizens, information was another casualty of war. The human toll was staggering. Survivors recalled the terror in their voices. One mother searched morgues for weeks, carrying her son's school photo. A shopkeeper who paid protection money was found dead in his store. His killers left a note on his chest: "This is what happens when you talk." Migrants passing through Baja became targets too, robbed, kidnapped, or forced to smuggle. Nobody was safe. The Mexican government, desperate to regain control, deployed the military. Soldiers in armored vehicles patrolled the streets. Black Hawk helicopters roared overhead. Police units staged raids across neighborhoods. But corruption seeped even here. Some officers worked for El Ingeniero. Others for El Teo. Checkpoints became death traps, civilians unsure if the uniform before them served the state or the cartels. Joint operations with federal agencies struck at stash houses, seized shipments, captured lieutenants. But for every arrest, another commander emerged. For every warehouse shut down, another opened. The arrests that were meant to cut off the snake's head instead multiplied the vipers. By 2008, Baja California was under siege. Over 800 people were murdered in Tijuana that year alone. Civilians whispered that the government had lost the city, that the cartels ruled the night. For those who lived there, the question was no longer if violence would strike, but when. And even as the military rolled through Tijuana's streets, the bloodshed didn't stop. In fact, it only intensified. By the late 2000s, the battle lines in Tijuana were no longer simple. The Arellano Félix family's empire had shattered into factions, each clawing for control. In this chaos, betrayal became the only currency. And at the center of that betrayal stood Teodoro Garcia Cimental, El Teo. Tired of sharing power, he turned against the remnants of the Tijuana cartel. His ambition was boundless, his brutality legendary. To strengthen his position, he reached out to an old enemy of the Arellanos, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and the Sinaloa cartel. El Teo aligned himself with Sinaloa, a move that tilted the balance of power across Baja California. With Sinaloa's endless resources, guns, men, money, El Teo unleashed terror on an unimaginable scale. His enemies were not just rival traffickers, but police officers, journalists, and ordinary families caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Meanwhile, El Ingeniero, Fernando Sanchez Arellano, fought desperately to preserve the old Tijuana cartel. His weapon was organization, strategy, and the loyalty of those still tied to the Arellano Félix name. But against El Teo's chaos and Sinaloa's wealth, his grip slipped. El Teo's reign of terror was defined by the torture houses. Across the city, nondescript homes became chambers of horror. Inside, victims were chained to pipes, beaten with bats, suffocated with plastic bags. Some were dismembered alive. Others were forced to watch before meeting the same fate. And then came the acid baths, where human remains were dissolved in barrels, leaving no trace but a chemical stench in the night air. Neighbors whispered but said nothing. To speak was to die. The screams, the smells, the disappearances, these became part of daily life. Bodies appeared everywhere. Dumped in canals, hung from bridges, left in the trunks of abandoned cars. Sometimes they were mutilated, messages carved into their skin. Sometimes they were staged grotesquely, naked, decapitated, stacked in piles. The city itself became a gallery of terror, each body a warning from one faction to another. No one was untouchable. Police chiefs were gunned down in broad daylight. Politicians were assassinated on their way to meetings. Informants were executed with notes pinned to their bodies. Each killing was not random, it was symbolic. A reminder that loyalty to the wrong side was fatal. The message was clear: the cartels, not the government, ruled Baja California. The violence was not confined to the streets. It extended into the very airwaves and newspapers of Baja California. Cartel banners, narcomandas, were draped from bridges, painted with threats against rivals and authorities. Journalists were hunted, silenced with bullets or bribes. Some fled the state entirely. Others stayed, knowing each article might be their last. Even music became a weapon. Narco corridos, ballads that glorified cartel leaders, spread like wildfire. Radios echoed with songs praising killers, embedding their legends into popular culture. For young men in Tijuana's barrios, joining a cartel wasn't just survival. It was a path to fame. Survivors recall this era with trembling voices. One journalist described receiving a phone call after publishing a report: "We know where your children go to school." Another citizen remembers hearing the screams from a nearby torture house but locking their windows, praying not to be noticed. The line between living and dying was paper-thin. Each day was a gamble. The government fought back, or tried to. Military patrols grew heavier, checkpoints doubled, raids more frequent. But corruption plagued every effort. Soldiers leaked information to the cartels. Police sold weapons to those they were supposed to arrest. For every progress report from officials, the reality on the ground told a different story. Baja California was drowning, and the killers held the lifelines. By the late 2000s, it seemed there was no limit to how far the violence could go. More than 800 murders in Tijuana in 2008. Nearly 1,000 in 2009. Each body was both a statistic and a warning. And still, the warlords craved more blood. The betrayal of allies, the silencing of voices, the destruction of communities, it was all part of their empire. The city lived in a constant state of siege. But the deadliest chapter was still ahead. Baja California's warlords were not done writing their message in blood. By 2008 and 2009, Baja California was burning. The violence had reached its peak. More than 5,800 people were killed in Mexico that year, and in Tijuana, the bodies surfaced daily. Some were found in the canals. Others dumped on highways. Many disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the torture houses or the desert graves. The city's morgues overflowed, their refrigerators failing, their staff numb from handling corpses day after day. Behind the numbers were human lives. A young medical student, caught in the wrong taxi, never returned home. A business owner, refusing to pay quota, extortion, was shot in front of his children. A group of migrants, dreaming of crossing into the United States, were kidnapped and vanished forever. Each story was a thread cut short, leaving families broken and searching. Mothers plastered photos on telephone poles. Fathers walked the streets with trembling hands, clutching missing person flyers. For many, survival meant silence. Students avoided night classes. Families sold homes and fled across the border. Those who stayed lived with constant fear, a knock at the door, or wrong look at a soldier, a stray bullet from the next gunfight. In Baja California, innocence no longer protected anyone. The violence had become impossible to ignore, especially across the border. The United States government, alarmed at the scale of killings just miles from San Diego, pressed Mexico for results. DEA agents worked wiretaps, tracking cartel conversations. Sting operations began targeting money launderers, traffickers, and corrupt officials. For the first time, the war in Baja was no longer just a Mexican problem. It was binational. Joint task forces moved in. Intelligence units swept through safe houses. Binational cooperation led to arrests once thought impossible. Pressure mounted on the cartels. And cracks began to show. Alliances faltered. The betrayals, once whispers, became action. For Teodoro Garcia Cimental, El Teo, the walls were closing in. His brutality had drawn too much attention. His alliance with Sinaloa was no longer enough to protect him. And then came the betrayal, from within his own ranks. On January 12, 2010, in La Paz, Baja California Sur, Mexican authorities captured El Teo. The man who dissolved bodies in acid, who terrorized Tijuana, was dragged out in handcuffs, his reign finished. But El Teo's fall did not bring peace. It left a vacuum. His rivals, his allies, his enemies, all circled like vultures, ready to claim what remained of his empire. Meanwhile, El Ingeniero, Fernando Sanchez Arellano, remained in hiding, isolated, increasingly cut off from loyal commanders. His once proud Tijuana cartel was now a shell of its former self, surviving in the shadows. Citizens held their breath. For a moment, they thought the nightmare might end, that the fall of these leaders could mean peace. But the truth was darker. The cartels were like a hydra, cut off one head, and two more grew back. The killings slowed, but they did not stop. Instead, new factions rose. Younger killers, more reckless, more desperate for power, stepped into the void. The DEA and Mexican government declared victories. Press conferences boasted of arrests, of seizures, of leaders captured. But on the ground, families still whisper the same words, "The war isn't over." And they were right. The blood was far from finished. Because the fall of El Teo and the isolation of El Ingeniero should have ended the war. Instead, it opened the gates for something far worse, new alliances, new betrayals, and a cycle of violence that refused to die. The war for Baja California did not end with the fall of El Teo or the isolation of El Ingeniero. What followed was not peace, but a reshuffling of power. With the Tijuana cartel fractured, the plazas they once ruled began to fall into the hands of their enemies. And above all, one cartel stood taller than the rest, Sinaloa. Backed by its vast networks, political influence, and the ruthless genius of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the Sinaloa cartel moved to tighten its grip over Baja California's border crossings. For a time, Sinaloa's dominance seemed absolute. Their control stretched from the Pacific coast through the deserts, funneling billions in drugs into the United States every year. But dominance in Mexico never lasts. In the shadows, a new threat began to rise. The CJNG, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generation. Known for their ferocity and their militarized discipline, they tested the waters in Baja, probing for weakness, waiting for the moment to strike. The seeds of a new war were already in the soil. For the citizens of Tijuana and Baja California, the so-called victories brought little relief. The silence of fear lingered. People still disappeared in the night. Families still searched morgues and hospitals for their missing. Many never found justice. Many never found closure. In neighborhoods scarred by violence, mothers warned children to stay inside after dark. Entire blocks stood empty, abandoned by families who fled across the border or deeper into Mexico. Generations grew up under the shadow of the war. Children learned the sounds of gunfire before they learned the sounds of fireworks. Teenagers watched classmates disappear. In some schools, empty desks were a constant reminder that not everyone made it through the semester alive. The war left scars not only on the land, but on the very soul of Baja California. Tourism, once the pride of Baja California, collapsed under the weight of bloodshed. Foreign visitors avoided Tijuana, Rosarito, and Ensenada. Hotels shuttered. Beachfronts went quiet. Businesses struggled to survive extortion, or closed their doors altogether. Even when tourists returned, the image of Baja had changed forever, from a vibrant gateway to Mexico, to a land haunted by cartel wars. But perhaps the most powerful weapon was silence. People knew the names of killers. They knew which houses hid torture chambers, which cops were corrupt, which businesses laundered cartel money. But to speak meant death. Entire communities lived under a code of silence, where even whispers could cost a life. That silence is what allowed the cartels to thrive. The war scarred Baja's culture, too. Songs, murals, and stories carried the echoes of violence. Narco corridos celebrated gunmen as folk heroes. Street art painted fallen capos as martyrs. Young men looked to the cartels not just as employers, but as legends. When violence becomes myth, it is never truly buried. For families of the dead, the wounds remain open. Tens of thousands across Mexico still search for their missing, still digging in fields with shovels, still carrying faded photos in plastic sleeves. Each unmarked grave uncovered in Baja tells the story of someone forgotten by the state, but not by those who love them. Sinaloa may have claimed victory, but peace never came. The silence was only a pause. Beneath it, CJNG's shadow grew larger. Rival factions plotted in secret. And the people of Baja California, still mourning their dead, braced themselves for whatever storm might come next. Because in Baja California, peace was never guaranteed. The next war was already brewing. Over 5,800 lives lost in less than a decade. Fathers, mothers, students, police officers, children, swallowed by a war they never chose. Baja California became the front line of Mexico's cartel wars, a battlefield where bullets replaced words and fear silenced truth. Here, alliances were written not with treaties, but in blood. Each betrayal etched in the bodies left on bridges. Each promise broken by the sound of gunfire in the night. Peace was never free. Every moment of calm was purchased with the lives of those sacrificed in the struggle. Families still search. Mothers dig with their own hands in the desert, hoping for bones. Fathers walk more corridors, praying for answers. Entire neighborhoods live with the silence of those who will never return. For the survivors, the war did not end. It lingers in the empty seats at dinner tables, in the classrooms where desks sit vacant, in the homes where laughter was replaced by silence. Generations carry scars they did not earn. The cost was not only human lives. It was trust, dignity, and the soul of a borderland once filled with dreams. Tijuana, Rosarito, Ensenada, cities scarred by a war that carved itself into their identity. And still, the question remains, was it worth it? The arrests, the seizures, the battles fought with tanks and soldiers in the streets. Or was it all just another chapter in an endless cycle, where every fallen leader gives rise to another, every cartel war births the next? Tonight, Baja California stands quieter, but not healed. Because peace here always comes at the cost of another war. This was not just a battle for drugs or money. It was a war for power, for fear, for control. A war that rewrote the lives of thousands and turned a border into a battlefield. This was the war for Baja California. And for those who survived, the echoes remain. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Share it, so more people can understand the true cost of cartel violence. Subscribe to this channel for more untold stories of Mexico's hidden wars, stories the world cannot afford to forget. Your support helps keep these voices alive. Because every story told is one step closer to making sure history is never repeated. This was the war for Baja California.